Welcome to the Beardsley Doctrine. My name is Randy Beardsley, and today I want to talk about Article 3. We reject the notion that our law enforcement officers are racist and corrupt. There's no evidence to support this. We support and are appreciative of their effort every day to make our communities safe and are counting on them for their continued service to preserve our God-given and our constitutionally protected freedoms. Now, why is this important? From the beginning of time, man has banded together in communities and has appointed honorable men and women to provide security for those communities, to help enforce the laws, and to protect the citizens' rights. These men and women, police officers as we call them today, have the sole job to protect the community. Every day, we rely on our law enforcement officers to protect our rights and to maintain order in our society. Our police officers take an oath to defend our Constitution and our rights first and foremost. These are men and women from our own communities. They live in our communities. Their children go to the same schools as our children. They shop at the same places that we do. They care about our communities just like we do. And they work to do the right thing because they're part of our community. They aren't swayed by outside influences because they're concerned with what's right for our communities. While there are other law enforcement groups, none are as committed to our success as our local law enforcement. Our local law enforcement officers and their families are subject to the same risks and lawlessness as we are if they fail to properly do their job. They know that their friends and their family are counting on them. You can't say that about most of the other agencies that work from afar and then go home to another community at the end of the day. From something as simple to a speeding ticket or as dangerous as apprehending a murderer, these men and women risk their lives every day and often deal with the worst segment of society day in and day out. Why? Because that's their job. That's what they swore an oath to do. Not only is this a dangerous job, it's a mentally taxing job. Few of us deal with potentially life-threatening situations every day in our jobs like they do. They have to deal with people all day that care little about our rights or laws and even less about the people in our community. When you deal with the worst segment of society every day, it can be frustrating. It can be difficult for an officer to distinguish between a criminal who's a risk to you and your community and a decent man who made a mistake. I may not like it, but I'm understanding of our police. It's after they just dealt with lowlifes all day, or hard on me because I drifted over the speed limit or I'm at the wrong place at the wrong time. I understand the strain and stress that they face every day. Every encounter they have has a potentially life-changing outcome. You should consider this threat they face every day as well. This is why it's so important for us to stand and defend these brave men and women. While we can't overlook when they do wrong, we must put it into context of the challenges of their job. We shouldn't rush to judgment and be first to condemn them while they use split-second judgment to protect their lives and the lives of others. These men and women's lives matter too, and the expectation that they should sacrifice their life every day to ensure that dangerous criminals' lives are preserved, it's hypocritical and it's wrong. While it may be true in every profession, there are those that aren't that good at their job, and it's no different in the police ranks. There are policemen that do a lousy job, or worse, abuse their power, just like in every other profession. But it's wrong to declare that all police officers are racist or corrupt. Not only wrong, but false. False rhetoric like this erodes public trust in our law enforcement. It endangers the lives of these men and women, and it endangers our lives by compromising their ability to protect our rights and protect our community. When our law enforcement officers can't do their job due to fear of false accusations, some penalty, jail time, or loss of their jobs, our communities lose as we become less safe, and our country loses as our rights become less secure. It's essential that our law enforcement men and women are treated with the respect and dignity that they deserve, and that we defend them against these false attacks, just as we count on them to protect us. Now, what's wrong today? The media, and many in our government, they waged an assault on the dignity of our law enforcement agencies. With no evidence except carefully edited clips picked from millions of police encounters every year, they work to manipulate weak-minded citizens to create a narrative that doesn't exist. They have encouraged, organized, and incited mob violence against these good men and women. Men and women of all races, with terrible consequences too. Rather than encourage respectful discourse with our officers, they encourage resistance and violence that results in bad outcomes for everyone involved. Rather than condemning criminals who start violent encounters with their officers, they encourage this violence, then condemn the officers who are forced to defend themselves. None of this makes sense. The wisdom of our justice system only allows an officer to arrest you and bring you to the station. An officer can't charge you with a crime. A DA has to do that. An officer doesn't get to decide if you stay in custody or not. A judge decides that. Nor can an officer convict you of a crime. That has to be done by a jury made up of members of your own community. An officer can't determine how long you're in jail before your trial. A judge does that. Nor do they get to decide your bail amount. A judge does that also. So in spite of all the checks and balances in our system, the media and the government create this false illusion of supreme police power and corruption that promotes bad outcomes that occur when people fight the police rather than respect them and recognize their role in our system. But specifically, in an attempt to discredit these good men and women and undermine their ability to keep our community safe, the media and many in our government are claiming our police officers are racist. But the only people guilty of racism in this case are the ones judging and labeling our officers, not based on their actions, but based on their skin color. This baseless accusation that racism is rampant in our police forces is wrong. It isn't supported by any statistical evidence, and actually, the evidence shows the exact opposite. This dangerous rhetoric and incitement by the media, it's not a victimless crime. If you think so, go ask the families of the officers shot and killed over the last several years. Ask the children of the officers assaulted over the last years and injured. Talk to the spouses of these men and women about the stress they've endured at the hands of these mobs that were incited by lies and false charges of racism directed at them. There are lots of victims when lies and violence are allowed to be incited against the very people we rely on to defend us from that violence. Now, by presenting the exception as the norm, they've created a false narrative in an attempt to bully and intimidate these good men and women of all races who are officers. These misleading actions have made our communities less safe, not safer. Have you ever really wondered why the media and the government would attack our police forces? Some think it's for the ratings, but I believe it's because our police forces are still committed to their families and their communities. I believe that these men and women, they still defend the Constitution as their first and foremost oath. I believe that these men and women have been the target of violence, harassment, and even death, not because of their corruption or racism, but in an attempt to coerce and intimidate them to betray their oaths and to participate in implementing policies at the community level that they know are bad for our families, our communities, and our country. I believe the bullying and intimidation against our officers has been committed in an attempt to drive these good men and women from our police forces and replace them with more easily corruptible officers who don't have an allegiance to our rights in our communities. I believe if these men and women were corrupt already, that they would be praised on TV, not vilified. But these officers are not corrupt. They're not willing to be intimidated into betraying their families and communities. As a result, they have been targeted to weaken their will and their resolve to do the right thing. Those who don't believe in America and our values, they hope that with the media demonizing our law enforcement and making them less effective, that they can use their incitement of angry mobs to unleash violence at any time on both the police and civilians alike. They think they can bully and intimidate our law enforcement officers and everyone else to betray their families and communities. They and the mobs they manipulate, they believe they can escalate their attacks against any American that dares to stand in the way of their lawlessness. But they've underestimated the American spirit. They're wrong. They won't succeed. Now, you may not have noticed, but these baseless accusations of racism and corruption and an incitement of violence, they never include our federal law enforcement agencies, with the exception of the Border Patrol. We'll deal with that in Article 18. Did you ever wonder why this violence is only directed at the men and women from your own community? Is it possible that most federal agencies have already been bullied into becoming political pawns that are already actively working to implement policies that are bad for your future? Think of the FBI investigating parents at a school board meeting. Our local law enforcement, they've been the target of these attacks because they aren't committed to these failed policies, but rather they are committed to our safety and our future. Think about this. As our law enforcement officers have been subjected to this hate, violence, and even death, who came to their aid? Did our political leaders? No. Most of them supported and encouraged these lies and directly participated in escalating the violence against these honorable men and women, rather than defending them. What about their police chiefs? Surely the men and women that lead these forces and have been entrusted to protect them, they would stand up and speak out against this hate, not turn away as the families of these officers were and are torn apart by lies and violence. But for the most part, complete silence. A few brave ones, they were quickly silenced with the loss of their jobs. A few others resigned. But the other 99.9%, they just fell in line. They were content to look the other way, seemingly willing to trade their honor and the lives of the officers they swore to protect, just to keep their jobs. But lots of police forces, especially in the big cities, they're unionized. It appeared certain that union leaders of these men and women would never allow the blatant incitement and implementation of violence against their own members. I believe they would demand an end to this violence, even organize industry-wide strikes if necessary to stop it. But good thing I didn't hold my breath, because once again, with very few exceptions, you could hear a pin drop when it was time for the union leadership to defend the dignity and lives of these men and women. Our officers have been betrayed by our political leaders. They have been abandoned by their police chiefs and ignored by the union leaders that they counted on to protect them. The only people brave enough to speak out against this violence are regular Americans. Now, what needs to be done? You could start by supporting the Beardsley Doctrine, because this means you're committing to stand up in support of our officers. While the media, our political leaders, our police chiefs and unions, they failed these men and women. America won't. We pledge to support and encourage these good men and women. And we vow to reject these false charges of racism and to reject the hate and violence directed at them. We don't believe in defunding our police, but rather, we believe in strengthening their resolve and resources to ensure that they have what they need to keep our communities safe. We can't let them be coerced into carrying out corrupt orders and policies that make our communities and our country less safe and less likely for success. We have to ensure that these honorable men and women who are committed to our families and our rights aren't forced for these critical jobs, only to be replaced with hand-picked corruptible people that aren't willing to defend what's right. Although this violence has the obvious consequence of discouraging good men and women from remaining or becoming officers, this is the exact outcome that they want. We can't let this happen. Good men and women from our community, our brothers, sisters, sons, and daughters, that have a willingness to serve in this role, we must encourage and support them to accept this difficult challenge, because our future, it depends on maintaining the honor and the dignity of our local police forces. There are a few things we must stop doing also. We need to stop supporting politicians who, rather than defending our officers, chose to participate in inciting the violence against them. With an election cycle coming around, don't fall for their newfound support that claims they support our safety and our officers. Make sure your votes are for real Americans with an allegiance to law and order that is more than talk around election time. We need to stop supporting media outlets that perpetuate these lies. We need to stop patronizing companies that advertise with these media outlets that perpetuate these false stories. Or some of these companies even weave these falsehoods into their own ads. We'll discuss how we can leverage our support when we get to the press plan. Without our strong support, the hate and violence that's directed at these men and women will continue to undermine their ability to protect our rights and to keep our communities safe. They are our last line of defense for maintaining our rights and security in our communities, in our country. We can't let them down. Now, I know there's a lot that we must do. Some people just want to talk about what's wrong. Others are resigned to our demise and say nothing can be done. There are even some that believe leaving our country is the best solution for their family. But me, I'm not going anywhere. My forefathers built this country. They gave their life for this country. And I serve this country. This is my country. While it's true that the enemies of our country, they're well-funded, deeply entrenched. They lack in numbers and rely on intimidation and economic coercion of good Americans. Even intimidation and economic coercion of our police chiefs, police officers, and police unions to enforce their hate upon the majority. For this reason, I developed the Beardsley Doctrine to help educate Americans of the failed policies that have been implemented in our country, and to energize Americans to take part in rejecting these failed policies and replacing them with policies that will lead to success for our country. If you're an American like me, just isn't ready to watch our police forces, one of the few remaining institutions that still believe in our families and our communities and in fulfilling their oath through the Constitution, get crushed under the weight of lies and injustice, then it's time to do something about it. If you're not sure how to support these men and women yet, what to say to them or their families to help encourage them, you can start by sending them this video, Article 3, to everyone you know to help our police officers and help make our communities more aware. You can make a difference. Now, when we meet next, I want to discuss Article 4. If you're retired, close to retirement, or plan to ever retire, I think it's critical that you listen to Article 4 to find out more about what's happening to the retirement funds that you contributed to your whole life, and why getting your money back in retirement, it's in jeopardy if we fail to act. Social Security is another institution that's under attack by way of the same failed policies that are undermining the rest of America's future. See you next time.